There was a king of England who never really wanted to be king. He wanted to be the most fashionable man in Europe, and the most admired host in London, and the most generous patron of the arts who ever lived. He wanted to be remembered as the man who made England beautiful. Instead, he is remembered as the stupidest king who ever sat on the British throne. A man who spent millions he did not have on buildings he did not need, and a woman he could not keep, and a crown that never quite fit right. This is the story of George Augustus Frederick, the Prince of Wales who became King George IV, and how he took the richest country in the world and nearly drowned it in his own appetite. Chapter 1. The most expensive prince in Europe. George was born in 1762, the first son of King George III, and from the moment he came out of the womb, he was treated like the most important person in the kingdom. He had his own household, his own servants, his own tutors, and his own budget. He was raised to believe that the world existed to serve him, and he never quite got over that belief. By the time he was a teenager, George was already displaying the two personality traits that would define his entire life. He had exquisite taste, and he had no idea how to pay for it. He loved clothes, he loved architecture, he loved music, he loved beautiful objects and fine wine and good food, and the company of attractive women, and he had absolutely no impulse control when it came to any of them. At 18, he was given an annual allowance of £50,000, a staggering sum that could have supported an entire village for a generation. He spent it all within the first year. He spent next year's allowance too, before he even received it. By the time he was 21, he was already in debt. His father, King George III, was a frugal man who wore plain clothes and ate simple food, and could not understand how a person could spend so much money on so little. The king refused to increase his son's allowance, so the prince did what any sensible young heir would do. He borrowed from bankers and merchants, and anyone who would lend to the future king of England. He borrowed so much that the interest alone was more than most noble families earned in a year, and when the creditors came knocking, he simply borrowed more to pay them off. He moved into Carlton House, a grand mansion on Pall Mall in London, and immediately began renovating it. He hired the best architect in England and told him to spare no expense. The renovations took over a decade and cost more than £200,000. The prince installed a Gothic library, a Chinese drawing room, and a dining room that could seat 100 guests on gold-rimmed plates. He commissioned paintings, sculptures, furniture, and chandeliers from the finest craftsmen in Europe. And when the work was done, he looked around the house and decided he did not much like it any more. So he bought another house. He was 23 years old, already 6 feet tall, handsome, charming, and completely out of control. The women of London noticed, and one of them would change his life forever. Chapter 2. The Secret Wife. Maria Fitzherbert was a Catholic widow 6 years older than the prince. She was not the most beautiful woman in London, but she had something that caught George's attention more than beauty. She was stable. She was calm. She did not flatter him or beg for his attention. She seemed almost indifferent to his royal status, and that drove him absolutely mad. He pursued her with the single-minded obsession of a man who had never been told no. He wrote her letters, sent her gifts, appeared at the same social events, and made a complete spectacle of himself in public. She refused him repeatedly. She told him she did not want to be his mistress. She told him she valued her reputation too much to become the prince's plaything, and the more she refused, the more desperate he became. In the summer of 1784, George staged a dramatic scene that would have been laughable if it had not been so disturbing. He stabbed himself in the chest with a sword, not deeply, but enough to draw blood and cause alarm. He sent for Maria and told her he would kill himself if she did not marry him. She was horrified and moved. Against every instinct she had, she agreed. They were married in a secret ceremony in her drawing room in December 1785. No one was told. The marriage was illegal under English law for two reasons. The prince was under 25 and did not have his father's permission, and Maria was Catholic, which meant any marriage to the heir to the throne was automatically void under the Act of Settlement. But to George, none of that mattered. He had the woman he wanted. The secret marriage to Maria Fitzherbert was the best decision George ever made, and the worst thing that ever happened to Maria. She was his true love, the one woman who genuinely meant something to him, but he could never acknowledge her in public. She could never be queen. She had to live in separate houses and pretend to be nothing more than a close friend. And eventually George's attention wandered. A prince cannot stay faithful to a woman he cannot claim, especially when there are so many other women who want him. Chapter 3. The Wedding That Never Should Have Happened. By 1794, George was in so much debt that even his creditors were worried. He owed over £600,000. His father refused to help unless George agreed to do something the prince had been avoiding for years: get married, produce an heir, secure the succession. The king chose a bride for him, Princess Caroline of Brunswick, a German cousin George had never met. When he learned who his intended bride was, he reportedly drank himself into a stupor. He already had a wife in his heart, even if the law did not recognize her, and the woman he was about to marry had a reputation for being eccentric, unrefined, and a little bit wild. The first meeting between George and Caroline was a disaster of epic proportions. George arrived at the party where they were introduced, took one look at Caroline, and turned to his companion and said, "I am not well. Pray get me a glass of brandy." Caroline was not impressed either. She later wrote that the prince was fat and nothing like his portraits. But the wedding went ahead anyway, because kings do not cancel weddings for personal reasons. On April 8, 1795, George married Caroline in the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace. George was so drunk during the ceremony that he had to be held upright by his attendants. He spent the wedding night lying in the fireplace of their bedroom, unconscious, while Caroline sat alone on the bed, wondering what she had gotten herself into. Somehow, despite everything, Caroline became pregnant almost immediately. 9 months later, she gave birth to a daughter. Princess Charlotte Augusta of Wales was born on January 7, 1796. She was healthy, beautiful, and instantly the most important baby in the kingdom. George and Caroline separated 3 days after the birth. He never lived with her again. He refused to share a house, a table, or even a room with the woman he had married under duress. Caroline took her daughter and moved to a separate residence, and the King of England's marriage became the laughingstock of Europe. Chapter 4. The Daughter Who Could Have Saved Him. Princess Charlotte was George's only legitimate child, and for a brief moment she was everything. She was smart, spirited, and deeply popular with the British public. She was exactly what the monarchy needed after decades of a mad king and a profligate prince. Charlotte loved her father at first, the way most children love their parents without understanding who they really are. She visited him regularly. She wrote him affectionate letters. She looked up to him as the handsome prince she had heard so much about. But as she grew older, she began to understand what kind of man her father really was. George was not a good father. He was too busy spending money and chasing pleasure to pay much attention to his daughter. He controlled her life from a distance, choosing her companions, restricting her movements, and treating her more like a political asset than a human being. When Charlotte wanted to marry a man she actually loved, George refused. He arranged a marriage with a Dutch prince instead. Charlotte fought back. She ran away from her father's house. She made a public scene, and in the end she won. She married Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, a German prince she genuinely loved. The marriage was happy. Charlotte was pregnant within a year. The entire country held its breath, waiting for the birth of the heir who would secure the throne and give everyone something to celebrate. The labor lasted over 50 hours. Charlotte gave birth to a stillborn son. She died of complications a few hours later. She was 21 years old. The news hit England like a thunderbolt. The shops closed, the churches filled. The entire country went into mourning for the princess who had been their hope for the future. And George IV, the king in waiting, the man who had spent his entire life chasing pleasure, locked himself in his rooms and did not emerge for days. He had lost the only person who could have saved his legacy. Chapter 5. The Pavilion. If you want to understand George IV, you need to understand the Royal Pavilion in Brighton. This is the building that sums up everything he was, everything he wanted, and everything he got wrong. Brighton was a small fishing village on the south coast of England when George first visited it in 1783. He loved it immediately. The sea air, the relaxed atmosphere, the escape from the formalities of London. He bought a modest farmhouse by the beach and turned it into a weekend retreat. But a modest farmhouse was never going to be enough for a prince with unlimited credit and terrible judgment. Over the next 30 years, George transformed the Brighton house into one of the most extraordinary buildings in Europe. He hired architects and told them to create something that had never been seen before. What they built was a palace that looked like it had been transplanted from the streets of Delhi. Massive onion-shaped domes, minarets, pagodas, intricate Chinese decorations, a dining room with a massive bronze palm tree holding up the ceiling, a kitchen with a glass roof, and Castile pillars shaped like palm trees. The entire building was a fantasy, a dream of the Orient, built by an Englishman who had never been east of Dover. The cost was astronomical. George spent over £160,000 on the Brighton Pavilion, not counting the furniture, the gardens, or the constant renovations. He installed a heating system that was the most advanced in Europe. He built a music room that was a masterpiece of Chinese-inspired decoration. He hired the greatest French chef of the age, Antonin Carême, to run his kitchens. He threw parties that lasted for days, with hundreds of guests eating from gold plates and drinking the finest wines in the world. The pavilion was beautiful, extravagant, and completely ridiculous. It was a statement. It was the prince saying to the world that he did not care what anyone thought of him. He was going to live exactly the way he wanted, on borrowed money, in a palace that looked like a wedding cake designed by someone who had never seen a wedding cake. Chapter 6. The Regency. King George III went mad in 1811. Not just eccentric or forgetful, genuinely, profoundly, irreversibly mad. He talked to invisible people. He claimed to see angels. He once shook hands with an oak tree, convinced it was the King of Prussia. Parliament stepped in and passed the Regency Act. The Prince of Wales would rule as regent until his father died or recovered. George was 48 years old, and finally, after decades of waiting, he had real power. The regency period was the golden age of George's life and the nadir of British public finances. He ruled as regent for 9 years, and during that time he managed to spend more money than any monarch in British history. He commissioned buildings, funded artists, threw parties, and ignored the fact that England was fighting a war against Napoleon that was draining the treasury. The term Regency style still refers to the elegant architecture and furniture of this period. George had an eye for beauty that was genuinely remarkable. He collected paintings by Gainsborough and Reynolds. He commissioned furniture from the finest cabinet makers. He designed uniforms for the army that were more about fashion than function. He was a patron of the arts in a way that few monarchs have ever matched, but he was also a patron of his own appetites. His weight ballooned. His drinking increased. His temper grew shorter. And his relationship with his wife, which could not have been worse, somehow managed to become even more toxic. Chapter 7. The Biggest Party in History. On January 29, 1820, King George III finally died at the age of 81. After 60 years of rule, 3 of them lucid and 57 of them varying degrees of sane, the old king was gone. George was 57 years old, with a waistline that had surpassed 50 inches and a reputation that was already in ruins. He decided to throw the biggest party England had ever seen. The coronation of George IV was the most expensive in British history. It cost over £240,000, more than any coronation before or since. The king personally oversaw every detail. He designed the costumes, he chose the music. He rehearsed the ceremony for weeks, making sure that every gesture, every bow, every movement was exactly right. He commissioned a new crown so heavy with diamonds that he could barely lift his head. He ordered a coronation robe made of gold cloth and ermine that weighed over 30 pounds. He insisted that everyone who attended the ceremony wear costumes from the Tudor period because he thought the 16th century looked more regal than the 19th. Parliament complained about the cost. The newspapers mocked the extravagance, and George did not care at all. The ceremony itself was magnificent. Westminster Abbey was packed with nobles in velvet and gold. The music soared through the ancient stone arches. The king processed slowly down the aisle, weighed down by his robes and his crown and his own enormous body, and for a few hours he was exactly what he had always wanted to be, the grandest monarch in Europe. But there was one thing missing. His wife was not there. He had made sure of that. Chapter 8. The queen he refused to crown. When George became king, Caroline of Brunswick became queen consort of England. By law, she was entitled to be crowned beside her husband. She was entitled to share his throne and his ceremony and his dignity, and she fully intended to claim it. Caroline had spent the last 20 years living in exile, traveling across Europe and causing scandals wherever she went. She had been accused of having affairs, of adopting a child who was not her own, of behaving in ways that were unseemly for a princess. But legally she was still the queen, and she was coming home. The king was horrified. He ordered his ministers to prevent Caroline from attending the coronation. He launched a formal investigation into her conduct, hoping to prove that she had been unfaithful, and thus disqualify her from the throne. The resulting trial, known as the Pains and Penalties Bill, was the most sensational legal proceeding in British history. Parliament debated whether the Queen was an adulteress. The newspapers printed lurid details about her supposed affairs. The public took sides, and most of them took Caroline's side, because no one liked a husband who tried to destroy his wife. The bill failed. Caroline remained queen, but the king had other ways to stop her. On Coronation Day, Caroline arrived at Westminster Abbey in a carriage, dressed in a white gown and wearing a diamond tiara. She expected to be admitted to the ceremony. She expected to be crowned. The guards at the door turned her away. They had their orders. The Queen of England was not allowed into her own coronation. Caroline stood outside the abbey while her husband was crowned inside. She tried 4 different entrances and was turned away from every single one. The crowd outside cheered for her, but the doors remained closed. She spent the rest of the day in a daze, wandering through the streets of London in her coronation dress, while her husband celebrated without her. 3 weeks later, she was dead. The doctors said she had a bowel obstruction. The public said she died of a broken heart. Chapter 9. The King's Body. George was not young anymore. He was approaching 60, and his body had been punished by decades of overindulgence. His face was bloated. His complexion was ruddy from alcohol. He could barely walk without assistance. He used a special chair with wheels to move through his palaces because climbing stairs had become impossible. His vanity, however, remained intact. He insisted that all portraits of him be flattering, and he destroyed any paintings that showed him as he actually looked. He wore corsets under his clothes to create the illusion of a waist. He wore wigs to cover his thinning hair and face powder to hide his blotchy skin. He invented a uniform for himself, a fantasy military costume covered in medals and gold braid, even though he had never served in the army or led troops in battle. He spent his days in the Brighton Pavilion, surrounded by his collections. He had amassed one of the greatest art collections in Europe. Paintings by the old masters, sculptures from ancient Rome, porcelain from China, books by the thousand. He bought everything that caught his eye, and he stored it all in rooms that he rarely visited. The collection grew, and the debts grew with it. Every year, Parliament had to approve additional funds to keep the king from bankruptcy. Every year, the newspapers published angry editorials about royal extravagance, and every year George ignored them all and kept spending. The people of England had started to call him by a new name, the Prince of Wales. It was not kind, but it was accurate. Chapter 10. The most expensive collection in history. George IV's art collection was one of the greatest ever assembled by a single person. He bought the library of his father, which contained over 65,000 volumes. He bought paintings by Rembrandt, Titian, Rubens, Van Dyck, and Canaletto. He bought the furniture of the finest French cabinet makers. He bought bronzes, marbles, cameos, and coins. He bought the entire collection of a Spanish art dealer in a single transaction. He bought things because he wanted them, but also because buying them made him feel powerful. The collection was housed in several buildings. Carlton House held the paintings. The Brighton Pavilion held the Chinese and Indian objects. Windsor Castle held the books and manuscripts. Buckingham Palace, which George had also renovated at enormous expense, held the furniture. None of these buildings was properly catalogued. The king himself probably did not know exactly what he owned. He once bought a painting and then bought it again months later because he had forgotten he already owned it. When he died, the collection was valued at over £500,000. It was one of the few assets he had left that actually covered some of his debts. The nation bought most of it. Much of what is now in the royal collection, the great treasury of art owned by the British monarchy, was originally assembled by the stupidest king in English history. He had incredible taste. He simply had no idea what to do with it. Chapter 11. The End of the Line. After Charlotte's death, George had no legitimate heir. His brothers were old, fat, and childless. The succession was in crisis. The king had 6 younger brothers, and between them they had produced exactly one legitimate child. That child was a girl named Victoria, the daughter of the Duke of Kent, who was born in 1819 and was now the only thing standing between the throne and a succession crisis. George did not care. He had no interest in his niece. He had no interest in the future of the monarchy. He had no interest in anything that did not involve food, drink, art, or the pursuit of physical comfort. He spent his final years in a fog of indulgence, eating elaborate meals prepared by his French chef and drinking bottles of fine wine every day. His relationship with Maria Fitzherbert had ended years before. He had taken other mistresses, but none of them meant anything to him. He was surrounded by servants and courtiers, but he had no real friends. He was the King of England, and he was the loneliest man in the country. In the spring of 1830, George fell ill. He had been sick before many times, but this was different. His breathing grew labored, his limbs swelled, his skin turned yellow. The doctors bled him and blistered him and dosed him with mercury, as doctors did in those days, and none of it made any difference. On June 26, 1830, George Augustus Frederick, King of England, died at Windsor Castle. He was 67 years old. His final words were reportedly, "Good God, what is this?" As he clutched the hand of his page, there was no great mourning. The newspapers published polite obituaries, but the public did not line the streets for his funeral. The shops did not close. The churches did not fill. The King of England was buried with surprisingly little ceremony. His body was placed in a vault at St. George's Chapel, where it still lies today. Next to the father he had spent his entire adult life trying to escape. Chapter 12. The Girl Who Followed Him. 7 years after George's death, an 18-year-old girl became Queen of England. Her name was Victoria, and she was everything George had not been. She was disciplined, frugal, hard-working, and genuinely interested in the welfare of her people. She did not build palaces she could not afford. She did not marry a woman she despised. She did not spend her entire inheritance before she had even received it. She cleaned up the mess her uncle had left behind, but here is the strange thing about George IV. He left a legacy that is more complicated than his reputation. The buildings he commissioned, the art he collected, the furniture he designed, the taste he cultivated, all of it survived him. The Brighton Pavilion still stands more ridiculous and beautiful than ever. The royal collection is still one of the greatest art collections in the world. The Regency style still defines the look of so many English buildings and interiors. He was a terrible king, a selfish husband, a negligent father, a disastrous spender, and an absolutely irredeemable human being. But he made England beautiful. He spent his entire life chasing pleasure, and in the process he created things that still give pleasure 200 years later. There is a lesson in that, if you want to find one, that even the stupidest king in English history could not ruin everything, that beauty outlasts bad decisions, that the world does not end when the king drinks too much and wears a corset and builds a palace that looks like it belongs in a fairy tale. The candles burn low at the Brighton Pavilion. The music in the great kitchen has faded. The king who ate everything and bought everything and married the wrong woman and lost the only daughter he had is a ghost now, walking through rooms he filled with treasures he never used. But the rooms are still there. The treasures are still there. And if you visit Brighton on a quiet evening, when the tourists have gone home and the sea mist rolls in from the channel, you can almost hear him laughing. A fat old king, drinking alone in his ridiculous palace, having the last laugh after all.